All right, guys. I'm going to go over the answers to the in-class assignment that was announced Wednesday during class. There are 6 scenario problems, and there's part for each scenario problem. You have part A, B, C, and D to answer. Part A, let's make this bigger. Part A, what is or are the factors and the levels of each factor? I asked you to write that in APA format. For each factor, determine whether it's between or within subjects. What is the dependent variables? Part C. And lastly, determine the hypothesis test and explain why your answer, or just justify your answer with some type of explanation. So here's the first scenario problem. And I have the answers, by the way, in the notes portion down here. You can see just in this video. So there's only one factor in this problem, and it's the amount of sweetness. The 2 levels are sweet and less sweet. There's flexibility with what you can call the factor. So you can also just call it sweetness. You can call it amount of sweetness, or you can call it sweetness. But the 2 levels are sweet and less sweet. That factor is between subjects, and the way you know this is by seeing in the scenario problem, the quote, participants were randomly assigned to one of 2 conditions, right here. Participants were randomly assigned to one of 2 conditions. That indicates that it's a between subjects factor. The dependent variable is the fullness rating, or you could say the amount of fullness. And then finally, the hypothesis test that you would use, there's actually 2 answers. Because we have just one factor with 2 levels, we can either, and it's between subjects, the factor is between subjects, we can either use the independent measures t-test, which you can also call the between subjects t-test. Either of those 2 terms, they're synonymous, interchangeable. So between subjects t-test is one correct answer. The other answer would be a one-way between subjects Anova. The justification is there is one factor with 2 levels. The factor is between subjects, so you can either use the t-test or you can use the Anova. So that's problem 1. Problem 2, there's once again just one factor. The factor here is amount of high fives with the levels 0, 1, and 2 high fives. Another acceptable way of naming that factor would just be calling it high fives. Once again with the level 0, 1, and 2. So there's just one factor. That factor, high fives, is within subjects. We know that because of the quote from the scenario. All participants completed each condition of the experiment on different days. It says it right here, all participants completed each condition of the experiment on different days. That's the clue that it was within subjects. The factor is within subjects. The dependent variable is the 100-meter dash time. You can also just say time. You could also just say seconds. For a lot of these answers, there are multiple terms that can be used for the answer, and all would be counted correct. Finally, the hypothesis test here, one way within subjects Anova. There's only one factor, and it is within subjects. And it's important to note here that you cannot use a t-test because there are 3 levels. 3 levels, once again, are 0 high fives, 1 high five, 2 high five. Therefore, you cannot do a t-test because t-tests only work when you have 2 conditions. When you only have 2 levels, this problem has 3 levels. It's got 1 factor, so you have to use the Anova. That factor is within subjects, so you use the one-way within subjects Anova. You could also call it like a one-way repeated measures Anova, because within subjects and repeated measures are synonyms. Problem number 3. This one's a little tougher because there are 2 factors here. The first factor is the amount of motivation with the levels motivation and no motivation. And the second factor is biological sex with the 2 levels of the 2 conditions, man and woman. Or you could say male and female, men, women. There's, once again, a little flexibility with what you can call these things. So we have those 2 factors, amount of motivation and biological sex. So we have to decide for each factor whether it's between or within subjects. So the factor motivation is between subjects, and we know that because participants were randomly assigned to one of 2 conditions, motivation or no motivation. There was only one condition or the other, therefore it is between subjects. For the factor biological sex, you kind of had to read between the lines to know that that's a between subjects factor, because you cannot actually randomly assign people to be men or women. You know it's between subjects because with only a small amount of exceptions, people are generally categorized as either men or women. And you certainly cannot perform an experiment where on one day people come into the laboratory and they're in the man condition, and the next day they come into the laboratory and they're in the woman condition. That can't happen. Therefore, you kind of have to infer that biological sex is a between subjects factor. The dependent variable is test performance or test score. And then finally, the hypothesis test you'd use to compare the means would be factorial between subjects ANOVA. The factorial part, because there are two factors. Both of those factors are between subjects, so you would use factorial between subjects ANOVA. I'll remind you, factorial means that your research design has two or more factors. And once again, t-test wouldn't work because there's more than one factor. You can only use a t-test if there's one factor with two levels. Here we have two factors. Therefore, no t-test would not work. You also could not use a one-way between subjects ANOVA because, once again, there are two factors. One way means one factor. So you can't use a one-way ANOVA because this research design had two factors. The correct hypothesis test would be factorial between subjects ANOVA. That was scenario 3. 3 more to go. Okay, so here the factor was type of coffee. People either drank decaf or people drank decaf on one day and then regular coffee on the other day. Another acceptable way of phrasing this, another way of naming the variable, you could be like amount of caffeine, no caffeine, or caffeine. So once again, kind of multiple correct answers. There's only one factor, but there's kind of multiple things you can call it. I think probably the best answer would be type of caffeine, decaf, or regular. So this factor is within subjects, and the clue is it's the quote from the scenario, each participant was assigned to all experimental conditions. Where does it say that? Right here, each participant was assigned to all experimental conditions. That indicates this factor, type of coffee, was within subjects. The dependent variable is reaction time, or you could just say time, or you could say seconds. In this case, you could maybe even just say milliseconds. And finally, the hypothesis test would be there's once again two correct answers here because we have just one factor, type of coffee, with two levels. Therefore, we can use a t-test or an ANOVA. The type of t-test would be a within subjects t-test, or you could call it a repeated measures t-test or paired samples t-test. Those are all synonyms. I just call it here a within subjects t-test, or you could use a one-way repeated measures ANOVA. Either of those would be correct answers. The justification is there's just one factor with two levels. If you have one factor, two levels, you can perform the t-test, or you can perform the ANOVA. And since the factor is within subjects, the type of t-test you perform is within subjects t-test or a repeated measures ANOVA. Repeated measures is just a synonym for within subjects. All right, number 5. So here the factor is the color of the room. And the levels are white, fluorescent green, and black. You could also just say another acceptable answer is the factor is called color, with the same levels, white, fluorescent green, and black. The factor called color is between subjects, and we know that because it says participants were randomly assigned to one of 3 conditions. The dependent variable in this one is test performance or test score. You can call it either thing, test performance or test score. Either of those is the correct way of phrasing the dependent variable. And finally, the hypothesis test would be one way between subjects ANOVA. There is one between subjects factor. That factor has 3 levels, those 3 different colors, white, fluorescent green, and black. Because the factor has 3 levels, we cannot do a t-test. Once again, the most amount of conditions, most amount of levels that can be in a factor, if you're going to use a t-test, is 2. This research design has 3 levels in the factor. Therefore, you have to use an ANOVA, not t-test. The factor here is between subjects. Therefore, we're using a one-way between subjects ANOVA. And finally, here's scenario problem number 6, and this one's kind of the hardest one because there are 3 factors here. So let's go through the 3 factors. First one I would call type of drug, experimental drug, or placebo. You could also just call it like drug, but the levels are experimental drug and placebo. You could also say like non-stimulant drug and placebo. That would be acceptable too. That's factor 1, type of drug, experimental, placebo. The second factor would be something like type of child. And then there's the children with ADHD, and then there's the control children. You could also say like type of child. You could also say something like diagnosis. Instead of saying type of child, you could say diagnosis, and you could say ADHD, no ADHD. Yeah. So there's, once again, multiple things you could call these things. I kind of like type of child, ADHD, and control. That's the second factor. And then finally, the third factor, amount of background noise. And then there's the noise condition and the no noise condition. So right here, these ones right here, these are just those same factors, but they're just kind of alternative ways of phrasing them. So there's 3 factors. For each one, we got to decide if it's between or within subjects. Drug is between subjects, and we know that because it says all participants were randomly assigned to take either the experimental drug or take a placebo. They're in one condition or the other, therefore a type of drug is between subjects. Child, or type of child, or diagnosis, that factor is between subjects because a child is either diagnosed with ADHD or not diagnosed with ADHD. A child cannot simultaneously have ADHD and not have it at the same time. A child cannot be assigned to have ADHD on one day and then come back into the laboratory the next day and not have ADHD. So kind of, once again, you have to infer that type of child is a between subjects factor. And then finally, background noise is within subjects, and it says, the quote, all participants were tested in both test noise conditions. It says that right here. All participants were tested in both test noise conditions, but on different days. So that factor is within subjects. So we have 2 factors that are between subjects, type of drug and type of child, and 1 factor which is within subject, which is amount of background noise or just background noise. The dependent variable is test performance, or once again, you could say test score. And then finally, the hypothesis test that you would use is factorial mixed ANOVA. So the reason factorial is correct is because there are 2 or more factors. There's actually 3 factors here. Anytime you have 2 or more factors, then your ANOVA will be factorial. And since we have at least 1 factor is between subjects and we have at least 1 factor is within subjects, that makes it a mixed design. Remember, a mixed design is when you have at least 1 between and 1 within subjects factor in your research design. Neither a t-test or a one-way ANOVA would work here because there are 2 or more factors, and there's 3 factors. A t-test and one-way ANOVA, those can only be used when you have 1 factor max. We have 3 factors in this problem, so we know we can't use a t-test or one-way ANOVA. So there are the answers to this. You turn this in Friday, and if you have questions or comments about this, I will give some opportunity at the beginning of class Monday. And I'll remind you that in this class, if you ask good questions, you can earn extra participation points. And I'll write down the names of people that ask good questions or have helpful comments. And so keep that in mind when I give you the opportunity on Monday to ask questions or make comments about this. Also, feel free to send me emails over the weekend. Otherwise, I will just see you in class Monday.